The United States runs a $28 trillion economy. It is the single most powerful economic engine in the history of human civilization. It survived the Great Depression, mobilized for World War II, and absorbed the shockwaves of the 2008 financial crash and a global pandemic. Yet in 2026, this machine is being pushed by a completely new set of forces. Decisions made at the highest levels of government are directly altering the cost of your groceries, your rent, and your daily life. In this video, we are cutting out the partisan spin to look strictly at the numbers, the history, and the policy choices of the last 6 years. Just as the dust finally started to settle from the pandemic and brutal inflation, the rules of the game changed once again. Right now, American households are facing an invisible $1,500 tax. To figure out why you are paying this specific cost today, you have to look at the massive historic levers the government has been pulling to steer the economy since 2020. To understand how those levers work, we need to look at how the U.S. economy is actually measured. That metric is Gross Domestic Product, or GDP, the total value of every good and service produced inside the United States in a single year. This chart breaks GDP into 4 engines: consumer spending, business investment, government spending, and net exports. Consumer spending dominates at 70%. But net exports is an anomaly. Buying more than we sell pushes this number below zero, creating a trade deficit. This specific vulnerability, the trade deficit, became a major political target, triggering the massive economic disruptions we are seeing in 2025 and 2026. The story of these disruptions starts in 2020. To prevent a total economic collapse during the COVID pandemic, both the Trump and Biden administrations pulled their first major policy lever. Together, they injected nearly $5 trillion of emergency stimulus into the economy. This historic flood of new money poured into a system where factories were closed and shipping containers were stuck at ports, shattering global supply chains. It created the textbook definition of inflation: too much money chasing too few goods. This graph of the Consumer Price Index shows the immediate consequence. By June 2022, inflation spiked to a 40-year high of 9.1%, quickly eroding the purchasing power of the middle class. To fix this, the Federal Reserve hit the brakes on the economy. Under Chair Jerome Powell, they aggressively raised interest rates 11 times to try and cool down demand. This was the first major trade-off. The government successfully saved the economy from pandemic collapse, but the mandatory price tag was a brutal era of high inflation that took years to cool down. By the time Donald Trump returned to power in 2025, inflation had finally started to normalize. That is when the administration pulled the second major policy lever, launching the most sweeping tariff regime in modern history to combat the trade deficit. The administration's logic was straightforward. Placing taxes on foreign goods would level the playing field, making imports more expensive and forcing manufacturing jobs to return to the United States. This strategy created massive legal friction. In February 2026, the Supreme Court struck down the broadest tariff authority, forcing the administration to pivot and use national security justifications to keep the taxes in place. This chart compares historical tax increases as a percent of GDP. The 2026 tariffs are the largest tax increase since 1993. They cost the average household $1,500 a year, with domestic consumers and businesses absorbing 90% of those costs. Because of those absorbed costs, inflation is beginning to creep back up, reaching 2.7% in early 2026. In the attempt to fix the international trade deficit, policymakers essentially traded one problem for another. They shifted the financial burden directly onto the domestic consumer. Supporters argue that the immediate pain of higher prices is a worthy sacrifice if it eventually rebuilds a self-sufficient American industrial base. And there is evidence that some domestic manufacturing is responding, with new investments rolling into high-tech sectors like semiconductor plants. But critics point out that this is a regressive tax that damages global trade. Vulnerable American sectors, like agriculture, have already been hit hard by retaliatory tariffs from other countries. This massive figure didn't appear overnight. The last time the U.S. ran a budget surplus was 2001, with the debt at $5.8 trillion. Since then, the balance has grown under every president, from both political parties, driven by wars, tax cuts, financial crises, and pandemic stimulus packages. President Trump deliberately signed what he called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act on July 4, 2025. It is the largest piece of fiscal legislation in recent American history, designed as a massive stimulus to jumpstart growth. This document outlines what the bill does. First, it permanently extends the 2017 tax cuts. Second, new temporary deductions for tips and overtime pay. Third, raising the SALT deduction cap to $40,000. Finally, creating savings accounts for children born after 2025. Passing the largest fiscal stimulus in recent history while sitting on the largest national debt in history creates a distinct collision. The government is injecting massive amounts of capital into an already strained system, setting the stage for a high-stakes economic stress test. The math is straightforward. $3.7 trillion in tax cuts minus $1.3 trillion in spending cuts leaves a $2.4 trillion deficit gap. To close it, the administration relies on economic growth. Projecting the bill increases real GDP by 4 to 5%, offsetting costs. Independent economists and the Congressional Budget Office model much smaller growth effects. Former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and others warn that adding trillions in borrowing is highly precarious. The stakes of this gamble are clear. If the promised explosive growth fails to materialize, the math breaks down, and the U.S. risks a debt spiral that could destabilize the economy by the 2030s. Trillions of dollars can feel abstract on a balance sheet, but carrying $38.7 trillion in debt has immediate, everyday mathematical consequences for the entire country. The clearest way to see this is by looking at the cost of carrying that debt. This pie chart shows total federal government spending. The U.S. government now spends over $1 trillion per year just on interest payments. In 2026, interest consumes 14% of all federal spending, making it a larger financial burden than the entire defense budget and Medicaid. This massive borrowing creates a dynamic economists call crowding out. When the government borrows so much, it competes with businesses for available capital. That demand drives up interest rates across the entire economy, making mortgages, car loans, and business loans more expensive for the average consumer. Carrying debt at 120% of GDP creates a severe structural vulnerability. If a new crisis hits, whether a pandemic, a war, or a deep recession, the government has very little fiscal room to respond. The financial ammunition is now largely spent. While Washington handles macro-level stimulus, the day-to-day job market in 2026 is caught in what economists describe as a low-hire, low-fire environment. Companies are not laying off many workers, but they are also not hiring aggressively. Finding a job now takes an average of 10 weeks, double the time it took just a few years ago. 3 distinct forces are reshaping this labor market. First, a dramatic slowdown in legal and illegal immigration has reduced the labor supply. Fewer available workers pushes wages slightly higher, but creates sharp labor shortages in construction, agriculture, and healthcare. Second, the Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk, has aggressively eliminated federal government positions and contracts. While this successfully reduces the government payroll, it also heavily reduces economic demand in regions that depend on government employment. Third, artificial intelligence is actively replacing tasks in knowledge work, eliminating entry-level jobs in coding, data analysis, and customer service. While it destroys some roles, it simultaneously creates highly specific new positions, like prompt engineering and AI oversight, that displaced workers cannot instantly fill. Ultimately, the average worker is caught in a profound squeeze. Washington is injecting stimulus at the top of the economy, but down on the ground, the job market is shrinking, shifting, and becoming much harder to navigate. Sitting between the government spending and the worker's wallet is the Federal Reserve. The Fed acts as the referee for the entire economy, operating under a dual mandate: keep unemployment low while simultaneously fighting to keep inflation around 2%. This projection shows the Fed's incredibly cautious position in 2026. They are holding the federal funds rate between 3.5 and 3.75%, and projecting just one rate cut for the entire year. They fear that aggressive rate cuts, combined with new tariffs and massive government stimulus, could quickly reignite inflation. This caution clashes directly with the White House, which urgently needs cheap money to fuel the growth required to pay for the new tax bill. President Trump has publicly demanded lower rates, while Fed Chair Jerome Powell insists the central bank will ignore political pressure and make decisions strictly on economic data. The 2026 economy is ultimately a high-wire act. Between an unprecedented deficit, a freezing labor market, and a central bank trying to apply the brakes, it is a precarious standoff between political ambition and mathematical reality. If you look at the top-level data, the United States economy is booming, but talk to everyday people, and they are struggling to pay bills. There is a massive disconnect between the spreadsheets and the streets. On paper, the post-COVID recovery was incredibly strong. Unemployment fell from 6.4% to 4.1%. We bypassed the recession most economists predicted, and for years we saw employers actively recruiting in a tight job market. Yet that same period brought the highest inflation in 40 years. Mortgage rates and home prices spiked simultaneously, leaving millions of younger Americans effectively priced out of homeownership. The American economy is currently enduring the most intense structural stress test of our lifetimes. Navigating this successfully requires identifying which parts of the system are holding the weight and which are beginning to crack. We can start with the load-bearing pillars. The first is a wave of massive federal legislation. Hundreds of billions of dollars are actively flowing directly into the physical economy, rebuilding roads and bridges across the country. Laws like the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act are subsidizing clean energy and forcing domestic semiconductor manufacturing to revive. These are physical factories being built right now to secure high-tech supply chains. The second pillar is the American consumer. Despite higher interest rates and elevated prices, consumer spending actually rose 5.3% year over year through early 2026. People are still buying, and that consumption keeps the engine running. The third pillar is energy production. The U.S. is now the world's largest oil and gas producer. That sheer volume of domestic energy provides a heavy buffer against global price shocks. Add to that the ultimate technological wildcard. The United States leads the world in artificial intelligence. If AI delivers even a fraction of the efficiency it promises, it will be the largest economic growth driver since the internet emerged in the 1990s. When you combine industrial investment, relentless consumer spending, energy dominance, and AI, you get incredible structural integrity. These are the structural forces that kept the U.S. economy out of the deep recession everyone thought was coming. But that structural integrity is under extreme pressure. While inflation was sparked globally by broken COVID supply chains, heavy domestic spending decisions poured gasoline on the fire, accelerating price hikes at home. Then there is the absolute largest structural threat to the entire system, the national debt. This chart shows the national debt climbing to $38.7 trillion, pushing past 120% of the total U.S. gross domestic product. The immediate consequence of a debt load that heavy is the carrying cost. The government is now paying over $1 trillion a year on interest alone. That money is effectively a structural drag, crowding out funding for everything else. The system is also bracing against unpredictable external shocks. Tariffs have completely restructured trade policy, bringing real short-term costs to consumers, while geopolitical instability continues to rattle global supply chains. Caught in the middle of this is the Federal Reserve. They are attempting to thread a nearly impossible needle, keeping interest rates high enough to kill off inflation without keeping them so high that they strangle economic growth. What we are watching is a high-stakes tug-of-war. The underlying fundamentals of the American economy are strong, but they are fighting against an overwhelming, expanding financial burden. So where does this tension lead us? We can look at what the leading economic institutions are projecting for 2026 and beyond. This data outlines our new reality. GDP growth is slower, settling near 2.4%, and unemployment projects to rise slightly. Inflation remains a pain point, projected at 2.7%, meaning prices keep rising faster than the Fed's 2% target. This chart highlights the quietest, most dangerous consequence of this environment. The wealth gap between people who own financial assets, like stocks and real estate, and people who rely primarily on wages is widening rapidly. The era of 0% interest rates is over. We are now living in a period of managed economic stress, an environment that rewards the financially informed and punishes the unprepared. The choices made over the next 3 to 5 years regarding trade, monetary policy, technology, and that massive national debt will lock in the financial reality for Americans for a generation. But the economy does not just happen to you, it happens around you. Paying attention to these macroeconomic forces is the single most effective way to understand when you should be aggressive with your investments, when you need to save, and when you should be cautious about taking risks. Immense structural stress defines the American economy, making individual economic literacy a non-negotiable tool for survival. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture, please subscribe. We translate complex financial realities into plain language every week. Drop a comment below. What is the biggest economic issue you think America needs to solve? I read every single one.
I hope you liked this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.